I went to the United States believing I had finally made it. A good job, a real opportunity, everything my family had sacrificed for, finally starting to make sense. But little by little, something began to change. It wasn't loud, it wasn't obvious. It was in the looks, in the silence, in the way people treated me without ever saying exactly why. At first, I told myself I was imagining things, until the day it stopped being subtle and became something impossible to ignore. His name was Arjun. He was born in a small city in India, in a family that didn't have much money but believed in something with all their heart, that education could open any door. His father was a math teacher at a local school. His mother sewed clothes at home to help pay the bills. They lived in a small apartment with his grandmother and his younger sister. There was an old ceiling fan in the living room that made a strange noise since Arjun was 8 years old. They never fixed it. There was always something more important to spend the money on. They weren't poor, but every little victory in that family cost twice the effort it would have cost someone else. Arjun studied hard, very hard. While other young people were going to the beach on holidays, he was home studying English, because he knew that English would be his ticket to something bigger. He gave up parties, trips, and sleep for years. At 26 years old, he received a job offer from a technology company in the United States. A good salary, a real opportunity. When he told his mother, she cried. When he told his father, the man went quiet for a few seconds. If you know men of that generation, you know that silence was the biggest applause he could give. Arjun packed his bags and flew across the world. The trip took almost 22 hours. When the plane landed, he looked out the window at the American sky and thought, with all the honest hope a young man of 26 can have, now it begins. The first days were wonderful. Wide roads, big supermarkets, the feeling that everything worked the way it was supposed to. He rented a room in a shared apartment with 3 other men, Diego from Mexico, Emeka from Nigeria, and Brad from Ohio. Brad was friendly, always smiling, the kind of person who offers you a drink before he even asks your name. It seemed like a good start. At the office, his manager, a man named Kevin, shook his hand firmly and said he was excited to have someone with Arjun's skills on the team. Arjun smiled, said thank you, sat at his desk, opened his computer, and started working with the energy of someone who has everything to prove. And he did. He knew he did. The first signs were small, so small that he almost missed them. In his first week during a team meeting, Arjun made a technical suggestion. Kevin nodded vaguely and moved on without saying a word about it. 40 minutes later, a colleague named Tyler made the exact same suggestion, just with different words. Kevin hit the table and said, "Yes, that's exactly it, Tyler. Great idea." Arjun looked at Tyler. Tyler did not look back at him. Tell yourself it was a coincidence. That Kevin didn't hear you clearly the first time, that it's not what you think it is. In his second week, he walked into the break room to get a glass of water. 2 colleagues were talking near the coffee machine. When he got closer, one of them said to the other, not quietly enough to be discreet, "They're hiring a lot of people from outside these days, aren't they?" And the other one answered, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "At least this one speaks English." Arjun picked up his glass, went back to his desk, worked until 8 o'clock that night. Tell yourself you heard wrong, that women like that exist everywhere and don't mean anything. In his third week, his roommate Brad had friends over to watch a football game. Arjun was sitting in the corner of the living room, working on his laptop. One of Brad's friends, someone Arjun had never seen before, sat near him to grab some popcorn from the table, looked him up and down and asked, with the kind of casual tone that is almost more offensive than open hostility, "Where are you from again?" "Pakistan." Arjun said he was from India. The man made a small expression, the kind people make when something tastes different than expected, and went back to the sofa without another word. Arjun closed his laptop, went to his room, stared at the ceiling for a long time. He didn't call his mother that night. She would have heard something in his voice, and he wasn't ready to explain what he still couldn't put into words, because that is the cruelest thing about quiet prejudice. It makes you doubt yourself before you doubt anyone else. You spend more time asking if you are being fair than asking if the people hurting you are being fair. And while you are busy questioning your own feelings, they just keep going. Arjun kept going too. He worked harder, delivered more, smiled more than he felt like smiling. He learned to step around the looks, to avoid the uncomfortable situations, to make his presence as smooth and unnoticeable as possible. Without realizing it, he was making himself smaller, and the worst was still coming. There is a kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with working long hours. It doesn't come from waking up early or staying up late. It comes from being on guard every single day. From waking up every morning knowing that you have to be better, more patient and more controlled than anyone else in the room. Not because you want to be, but because you feel like you have no choice. Because any small mistake you make will be seen in a way that the same mistake from someone else never would be. If you have ever worked in a place where you felt like you had to prove yourself twice as hard just to be seen as equal, you already know what Arjun was living through. He had been living that way for nearly 3 months, when things began to change in a more concrete way. The most important project of that period was the redesign of the company's scheduling system. His manager, Kevin, had divided the team into 2 groups. Arjun's group had 4 people, himself, a developer named Priya, another Indian, which would soon become relevant, and 2 Americans named Tyler and Connor. Tyler was the kind of person who walked into every meeting with a cup of coffee and an opinion in that order. Connor was quieter, capable, and had the rare quality of listening before he spoke. Priya had arrived at the company 6 months before Arjun. She had graduated from one of the most competitive universities in India. She was brilliant in a way that was almost hard to watch, the kind of person who solves in 20 minutes what would take others hours. But there was something about her that Arjun recognized from the very first day. She had also learned to make herself smaller. In the first days of working together, Arjun and Priya exchanged very few words beyond what was necessary, not because they were cold toward each other, but because of an unspoken rule that immigrants in difficult environments often follow. You don't get too close to someone who looks like you, because you know it will feed the stereotypes. You try to blend into the group instead of standing at the edges, but one Tuesday afternoon, while everyone else had gone to lunch and the 2 of them were alone in the office, Priya turned to him and said, in a low voice, as if confessing something, "Do you also count the number of times your idea is ignored before someone else repeats it?" Arjun paused, looked at her. "I stopped counting in the 2nd week," he said, "because it was getting hard to pretend I wasn't counting." She gave a short laugh, the kind with no humor in it, and in that moment, without any drama, without any big declaration, the 2 of them understood something. They were seeing the same thing. They were not imagining it. There was a pattern. The pattern became clearer in the weeks that followed. In meetings, Tyler spoke and Kevin took notes. Arjun spoke, and Kevin looked at his phone. Priya spoke, and Kevin waited for her to finish, then turned to Connor to ask what he thought about what she had just said, as if her words needed to pass through someone else before they could be accepted. One day, Arjun sent Kevin a detailed email with a proposal that could make the system run nearly 30% faster. He documented everything, every step, every test, every result. Kevin replied with 2 words, "Will review." 3 days later, in a team meeting, Kevin presented a very similar solution, as if it were an idea that had come up naturally in an internal conversation. He did not mention Arjun's name. He did not mention the email. Tyler applauded. Connor stayed quiet. Priya glanced at Arjun from the side. Arjun said nothing, but he remembered everything. It was around that time that Arjun noticed something that disturbed him in a different way, his own change in behavior. He had arrived in the United States full of energy and ready to contribute. Now he was becoming more and more withdrawn. In meetings, he waited to see if someone else would speak before he opened his mouth. At team lunches, he chose to sit at the end of the table to avoid having to push his way into conversations. He started writing shorter, more neutral emails, with no personality, because he had learned that his personality seemed to make people uncomfortable. At night in the apartment, his roommate Emeka would sometimes ask how his day had been. Arjun would say, "Fine," because it was easier than explaining. Emeka had his own weight to carry. He didn't need Arjun's too. Brad was still friendly. But Arjun had come to see that Brad's friendliness was the kind that costs nothing, the easy smile, the quick joke, the warmth that disappears when it becomes inconvenient. One evening, Brad brought more friends to the apartment. Arjun was in the kitchen cooking rice, because the comfort of familiar food was one of the few things that still made him feel like himself. When he heard one of Brad's friends ask loudly, with no embarrassment at all, "Man, what is that smell? Is that curry?" And Brad, his friendly roommate Brad, laughed and said, "That's Arjun. He cooks that Indian stuff. You get used to it." That Indian stuff. Arjun turned off the stove, put the rice in a container, went to his room. He ate alone, sitting on the edge of his bed, with his laptop open and something playing on the screen that he wasn't really watching. He called his mother later, when he knew she would be awake back home in India. She asked if he was okay. He said yes. She asked if he was eating well. He said he had just had dinner. She said she missed him. He said he missed her too. He hung up and stared at the wall for a long time. The discovery that changed everything happened on a Friday afternoon, completely by accident. He needed to print a document, but the printer near his desk was broken. He walked to the supply room on the other side of the office, near the administrative area. The door was slightly open. While he waited for his document to print, he heard voices from the hallway just outside, Kevin and Patrick, the human resources director, talking to each other. He wasn't trying to listen, but the sound carried. And then he heard Kevin say in a completely relaxed tone that made Arjun's blood run cold, "Arjun is technically good, but he has a cultural fit problem. You know how it is. The clients sometimes react strangely." A pause from Patrick. "And Priya?" "Same thing. They're very closed off, hard to integrate into the team." Arjun picked up his printed document, walked back to his desk with slow, controlled steps, sat down, breathed, opened a random file on his screen so he had something to look at. Cultural fit. He knew exactly what those words meant when used that way, in that context, about people like him. They were the polished disguise, the corporate way of saying something that would be unacceptable to say out loud. This was never about work. It had never been, and now he was certain. There is a difference between knowing that something is happening to you and having to face it in front of other people. The first kind of pain lives inside you, in the silence of your room in the dark of 3 in the morning when you can't sleep and you keep replaying moments in your mind, searching for another explanation. The second kind of pain is different. It hurts on the outside, it hurts in the air you breathe, it hurts in the eyes of the people who watch and do nothing, and it is that second kind of pain that changes you forever, because after it, you are never quite the same person you were before. If you have ever been humiliated in front of others, at work, in a meeting, in front of people you respected, you already know what I mean. You know that particular silence, the one where everyone in the room knows what just happened and nobody says a word. Arjun was about to live through that silence. After hearing Kevin's conversation with Patrick in the hallway, Arjun spent a few days in a strange state, a mix of clarity and paralysis. On one hand, he had finally confirmed what his gut had been telling him for months. On the other hand, he didn't know what to do with that information. Confront Kevin? With what? A conversation he had overheard by accident, with no witnesses, that Kevin could deny with a smile and a look of fake concern. He told Priya, quietly, one afternoon, when the others had left for an outside meeting. She listened without blinking. When he finished, she was silent for a few seconds. Then she said something he never forgot. "I already knew, Arjun. I was just waiting to see if you would figure it out on your own, or if you needed someone to tell you." He asked why she hadn't told him before. She answered with a tiredness that wasn't bitter. It was just worn out. "Because when someone like us tells another person like us, it sounds like we are convincing each other that something exists when it doesn't. I needed to know that you were seeing it with your own eyes." They sat in silence for a moment. Then she went back to her work. So did he. But something had changed between them. A quiet alliance, the kind that forms between people who are fighting the same battle without ever having chosen to fight it. The big meeting happened on a Thursday afternoon in November. It was the quarterly results presentation, the kind of event where the whole company gathers in a large room with a projector, coffee, and the kind of forced friendliness that companies put on when they need to look united in front of numbers. Something felt different the moment Arjun walked in. Kevin was standing near the projector, with an expression that was hard to read. Patrick, the human resources director, was sitting in a side chair with a notepad in his lap. He didn't usually come to these meetings. Arjun sat down. Priya sat next to him. Tyler and Connor arrived together, laughing about something. The meeting started normally. Numbers, goals, results. Kevin presented the quarterly performance with the confidence of someone who knows the numbers are good, and they were. The scheduling system project had been completed ahead of schedule, and the results were better than expected. The clients were happy. The directors were happy. And then Kevin said something that changed the temperature of the room. "I want to take a moment to recognize the work of the team. Tyler, Connor, you were fundamental. This project belongs to you." Applause, smiles. Tyler nodded with the practiced modesty of someone who had been expecting exactly that. Priya and Arjun were not mentioned. Arjun breathed slowly. This he already knew. It hurt, but he already knew it. But Kevin wasn't finished. And since we're talking about the team, he continued in a tone that shifted slightly, it became more casual, more relaxed, which was exactly the signal that something was about to be said that shouldn't be said that way. I want to open a conversation about team dynamics. We've been getting some feedback from clients about communication, about clarity in interactions. He paused and looked at Arjun. It wasn't a long look. It was quick, almost invisible. But everyone in the room followed it, and in 1 second, without a single name being spoken out loud, Arjun became the subject of the conversation. Sometimes, cultural and language barriers can create noise in the process, Kevin continued, still in that casual tone as if he were commenting on the weather. It's nobody's fault. It's just a reality we need to manage. Silence. Arjun felt the heat rise up through his neck. He felt every pair of eyes in the room, some looking away quickly, others fixed on him with that uncomfortable curiosity of people watching an accident and unable to look elsewhere. Tyler looked at the table. Connor looked at Arjun, and his was the only face in the room that showed something close to genuine discomfort. Patrick wrote something in his notepad, and Priya, sitting right next to him, went completely still. He could feel the tension in her body without even turning to look. Cultural and language barriers, said like that in front of everyone, without his name but with his face as the visual reference, an accusation wrapped in corporate language and delivered with the smile of someone who believes they are being polite. He had been publicly humiliated in a way that left no visible marks, the kind of humiliation that, if you complain about it, makes you look like you are overreacting. Too sensitive, too difficult. For a few seconds, Arjun didn't move. He stared at the projector behind Kevin. His mind was strangely quiet, not the emptiness of shock but the odd clarity of someone who has reached their limit and discovered, upon arriving there, that the limit was not where they thought it was. He had a choice. He could swallow it, like he had swallowed the comment about the curry, like he had swallowed the email with no reply, like he had swallowed every look, every ignored idea, every cultural fit whispered in a hallway. He could lower his head, wait for the meeting to end, and go home carrying one more stone in his chest. Or he could speak. He raised his hand. Kevin blinked. He clearly had not expected that. "Excuse me," Arjun said. His voice came out steady, not loud, not shaking, steady. "You mentioned communication barriers as a problem. I would like to understand that better. Do you have a specific example of a situation where my communication caused a problem with a client?" Complete silence. Kevin opened his mouth, closed it, smiled with the visible effort of someone recalculating their route. "This isn't a personal criticism, Arjun. It's a general observation about—" "But you looked at me while you were speaking," Arjun said. Still the same tone, still controlled. "So I have to assume there was a specific reference, and if there is, I would like to know what it is, so that I can improve. Do you have an email, a recording, any documented client feedback that I could review?" The silence now had weight. You could almost touch it. Kevin adjusted his collar. "Let's continue this conversation afterward, Arjun." "I would be happy to," Arjun replied, "but I would prefer that Patrick be present, since he is already here." Patrick looked up from his notepad for the first time since the meeting had begun. He looked at Kevin. He looked at Arjun. He wrote something down. The meeting continued, but something had broken in the air of that room, an assumption, an expectation, a certainty that some people had about how Arjun would behave when cornered. He had not shouted. He had not lost control. He had not given anyone the scene they may have been expecting. He had done something far more unsettling for people who practice that kind of calculated humiliation. He had asked for proof, but the real turning point didn't happen there. It came 3 days later, when Arjun found out what Kevin had done before that meeting and what he was planning to do after it. It was Connor who came to find him, on Friday afternoon, when the office was almost empty. He sat in the chair next to Arjun's desk, with the expression of someone who is about to do something they know they should have done much earlier. "I need to tell you something," Connor said, "and I need you to know that I am sorry I didn't speak sooner." Kevin had sent an email to company leadership 2 weeks before the meeting, an email in which he suggested, with careful language and management terms, that Arjun and Priya represented a cultural integration challenge, and that it might be more productive to reallocate the resources, meaning them, to roles with less client contact, or to consider other solutions. Connor had been copied by mistake, and he had stayed quiet for 2 weeks. "Why are you telling me now?" Arjun asked. Connor took a moment to answer. "Because what he did in that meeting was cowardly. And I was cowardly for not speaking before. I don't want to keep being that. Arjun looked at Connor for a long time, not with anger, not with excessive gratitude, with the honest assessment of someone who is learning, perhaps a little late, to tell the difference between allies and bystanders. "Do you have that email?" Arjun asked. Connor nodded. "Then I'm going to need a copy. Nobody tells you what happens after. After the courage, after the confrontation, after the moment you decide you are not going to swallow it anymore. Stories usually end right there, at the turning point, with the feeling that everything is going to be resolved because you finally did the right thing. But real life doesn't cut to the next scene. It keeps going, messy and incomplete, and you have to live inside it, even when the pieces haven't fallen into place yet. I know this because I lived through the months that came after, and they were, in ways I didn't expect, the hardest of all. If you have ever stood up for yourself after a long time of staying quiet, at work, in a relationship, in a family, you know that the moment of courage is not the end of the story. It is just the beginning of a different, harder chapter. On the Monday after his conversation with Connor, Arjun arrived at the office earlier than usual, 35 minutes before anyone else. He sat at his desk, opened his email, and sent a formal message to Patrick, the Human Resources Director, requesting a meeting. In the email, he mentioned that he had become aware of internal communications that raised serious questions about how performance was being evaluated. He said he would like to discuss the matter with the appropriate documentation present. He did not mention Kevin by name. He did not use aggressive language. He was precise, formal, and completely calm, because he had learned in those months that anger was a luxury he could not afford without it being used against him. Patrick replied in less than 2 hours. "Meeting scheduled for Wednesday," Arjun told Priya that same morning. She listened, stayed quiet for a moment, and then said, "I want to be in that meeting." He said yes, that it was fair, that she had just as much right to be there as he did. She nodded, then went back to her work without another word. But there was something different in the way she was sitting, perhaps 1 centimeter straighter in her chair, small enough that no one else would notice. Arjun noticed. The meeting with Patrick lasted nearly 2 hours. Arjun presented the email that Connor had forwarded to him. He presented the complete record of the scheduling system project, with dates, deliverables, and performance numbers, showing that he and Priya had been responsible for more than 60% of the core technical work, while their names had been consistently left out of every public recognition. He presented the history of emails, where his suggestions had been ignored and later adopted without credit. He did not cry. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with the precision of someone who had spent months, without fully realizing it, keeping a mental record of every situation, as if some part of him had always known that one day he would need to present it exactly this way. Patrick listened to everything, asked questions, took notes. His expression was difficult to read, not the look of someone pretending to be surprised, but also not the look of someone who was genuinely shocked. It was the expression of someone who perhaps already knew parts of this story and was now being forced to acknowledge it formally. At the end of the meeting, Patrick said that the company took workplace environment issues very seriously and that there would be an internal investigation. Arjun said he hoped that was true. Patrick said he understood the distrust. Arjun walked out of the room not knowing what any of it meant in practice. But he had done it. He had said out loud, to someone with the authority to act, what had been done to him. That simple act, naming it, felt lighter than he expected and heavier than he could explain. What came in the days that followed was strange in a way he hadn't predicted. Kevin avoided him completely. In the hallways, Kevin looked away with the quiet urgency of someone who suddenly finds their phone very interesting. In team meetings, he was excessively formal with Arjun, the kind of formality that is, in itself, a confession. Tyler continued acting as if nothing had happened, which was perhaps the only honest response he was capable of giving. Connor greeted Arjun every morning with a seriousness that carried regret in it, and Arjun accepted that because late regret is still regret. But what surprised him most was the silence of the others, people he had worked alongside for months. People who had been in the room that Thursday, people who had heard Kevin talk about cultural barriers while looking directly at Arjun. They said nothing. Not after, not during, not ever. They passed him in the hallway with light smiles, as if nothing had happened, as if silence were a neutral position and not a choice. That was when Arjun learned something about prejudice that nobody usually talks about. It rarely survives, only through the actions of the person who practices it. It survives through the silence of the people who watch. 3 weeks after the meeting with Patrick, Kevin was transferred to another division of the company. He was not fired. There was no official announcement explaining why. He simply stopped being Arjun's manager. A woman named Diana, calm, direct, the kind of person who looks you in the eyes when she speaks to you, took over the position. Some people asked Arjun if he felt good about that, if it was enough, if it felt like a victory. He never quite knew what to answer, because the truth is that when you go through something like this, you don't come out the other side whole. You come out different. Parts of you that existed before, the easy trust, the willingness to believe in good intentions before you have any evidence, the lightness of walking into a room without first calculating the risks, those parts don't come back easily. Some of them may never come back at all. He had arrived in the United States at 26 years old with a kind of innocence that was at the same time his greatest weakness and his greatest strength. That innocence had been used up. What replaced it was something else. Not bitterness, but a clarity that sometimes felt as heavy as lead. He called his father one night in December. It was late in the United States, early morning back home in India. His father answered with the slightly rough voice of someone who had just woken up, and Arjun felt a small sting of guilt for calling at that hour. He told him everything. For the first time, he told him all of it, from the comment about the curry, through the meeting all the way to Kevin's email and the internal investigation. He talked for perhaps 40 minutes without stopping, and his father listened without interrupting, which was unusual because his father always had an opinion about everything. When Arjun finished, there was a long pause, and then his father said, with the slow, careful voice of someone who chooses his words the way you choose something you want to last, "You did the right thing, Arjun, not because it guaranteed any particular result, but because 20 years from now you will be able to look back and know that you did not bend when bending would have been easier." Arjun couldn't respond right away. His father continued, "Your grandfather worked 40 years in a factory where nobody ever pronounced his name correctly. He never said anything because he thought he didn't have the right to. You had that right, and you used it. That matters." Arjun hung up a little while later and sat on the edge of his bed in the dark for a long time doing nothing. It wasn't happiness he felt. It wasn't relief. It was something quieter and more permanent, the feeling of having honored something that existed before him and would continue after him. He stayed at the company for 8 more months after that. With Diana as his manager, things changed. Not all at once, not overnight, but in real and concrete ways. His contributions began to be recorded. His name appeared in the reports. In 1 quarter, he received a performance review that was, objectively, the highest on the team. But he had already made his decision before that review came in. He had spent those months quietly building something that Kevin, without meaning to, had given him, the certainty that he did not need anyone's validation to know what he was worth. He resigned on a Monday in August, with a formal letter, a full transition period, and sincere thanks to Connor and Diana, the only 2 people he said goodbye to in person. Priya stayed. It was her choice, and it was a valid one. They exchanged numbers. They promised to stay in touch. They kept that promise, which is rarer than it sounds. Today Arjun works at a smaller company, founded by a man who was born in Egypt and built his business here without ever hiding where he came from. The team is diverse in the way that diversity is supposed to be, not as a policy, but as the natural result of hiring people for what they do rather than for what they represent in someone else's imagination. He is not the same person who arrived with a suitcase and an overly simple dream. He is more careful now, more observant, slower to trust, which sometimes costs him connections that could have been good, and that is a real loss, not something to romanticize, but he is also more honest. With himself and with others, he learned that silence, when it comes from fear, protects nobody. It only delays the moment when you will have to decide who you are. And he learned that underestimating someone, ignoring their ideas, erasing their name, treating them like background noise in a room where they deserve a voice, is not only an injustice, it is a mistake, because the people you try to quietly break are exactly the ones who learn, sooner or later, to speak louder. His grandfather never had the chance to speak. He did, and he did not waste it. This story ends here. But the question it raises does not. How many people around you are quietly swallowing what they should be allowed to say out loud? And what would you do if you were Connor and the moment finally came to choose?